welcome to the Townsend Institute Podcast Series, Tips, a show produced by the Townsend Institute at Concordia University, Irvine. This podcast provides tips into leadership, coaching, and counseling topics aimed at helping listeners grow in both their personal and professional lives. I'm Dr. John Townsend, psychologist, organizational consultant, and author of over 30 books, including the New York Times best-selling Boundaries series. I'm also the founder of the Townsend Institute, and I'm excited to introduce your podcast hosts, Townsend Institute Program Directors Dr. Ashley Andrew and Dr. Gilbert Fugit.
On today's podcast, we interview our friend and colleague, Dr. Kaitlyn Stafford, Assistant Director for the Townsend Institute's counseling programs. Dr. Stafford is a certified EMDR clinician who specializes in working with service members, veterans, and those suffering from addiction disorders. Dr. Stafford is also committed to helping educate clinicians on the military culture. Her current research interests include the career and life satisfaction of military spouses, as well as continued work training clinicians in Ukraine. Kaitlyn is proud of her South Louisiana roots, which she shares with her husband and young son in their current home state of Florida. Gilbert, tell our listeners a little bit what's in store today.
Ashley, this is a great podcast. I didn't know the difference between big T and little t in trauma, so we get to learn about that.
Me either.
I know. This is fantastic. And then I also get to talk about some work they're doing with a counseling center in Kyiv over in Ukraine. And then also how the Townsend model really works well, especially the character capacities with trauma counseling. So all of these are great parts, but of course, the one that everybody loves to hear is the tip of the week. So
let's take it away and listen to Dr. Stafford. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our latest episode on the Townsend Institute Podcast Series. We are excited here to be joined by Dr. Kaitlyn Stafford. We're going to open it up right with a question. Kaitlyn, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background and experience in the trauma work you do in the Ukraine?
Yeah, so I think I'll start a little before that with just what got me into studying and working with trauma. So I often tell my students this story because I think the work that I do it's a unique line of counseling, and it's something that I didn't know I always wanted to do. So early on in my time in the field, I was interning at an inpatient facility with service members that were actively or had recently served in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And at the time I knew I wanted to work in the field of mental health. Obviously, I was getting a degree in the mental health field, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to specialize in. And, I never will forget, there was a moment, it was pretty early on in my internship where I was sitting in a group of combat service members, and they were talking about some pretty horrible things. And I will say I'm not the person that, can tolerate, medical facilities well, like I pass out with needles and things like that. So all of that to say that, I was in their presence. I was hearing pretty graphic details about a war situation, and I wasn't shaken by that, which was actually really surprising to me, just given my own experiences. And in fact, I found myself, it was almost like a spiritual experience where I was hearing all of these combat service members' stories and watching vulnerability and healing unfold in this moment. And I just knew in that moment, this is it. I want to work with trauma, and I want to dedicate my career to being the best at what I can do to help people, that are like in this room, like these combat service members. So that's kind of what inspired me. I was really fortunate early on to work with great mentors who were also trauma clinicians. And so I was trained in some of the gold standard trauma therapies early on, and really wanted to just commit to continue to grow that. And so that led me a bit into my doctoral studies, which during my doctoral studies, I was connected with, she's our director now, Olya Zaporozhets. She is a professor at Regent University, and also has started the work that I do in Ukraine. She started that project. And at the time, it was 2017, and I was just trying to see how I could take my passion of doing trauma therapy abroad, essentially. And when I got involved in the project, it just continued to evolve. And at the time, there was the conflict in Crimea, and they had lost a lot of service members, and Olya and her team had developed a counseling program there. So training counselors and how to work with clients, how to work with service members. But there was really a high need in basically creating systems of care. I mean, I think, when I look at the work I've done in Ukraine, when I work with those students that I work with there, they have very little resources when it comes to mental health compared to what we have. I mean, we can pick up a book, we can order a book off of Amazon that's in our language. We can utilize that to work with clients. There's not a lot that is translated for them or hasn't been, over the years. And so the counselors there, the students that, I initially worked with were just hungry for knowledge. And so that's how it started. So I started working with them in their counselor training program. It eventually became a master's degree that's accredited by the Ministry of Education over there. And then in 2018, we established a counseling center. It's called Open Doors, where our students were able to complete their internships there, as well as serve clients in the community. And so that's some of the work that we've done. I will kind of put a plug that in 2017, I spent extensive time over there. There was a period of almost a month where we were meeting with government officials and trying to work to establish systems of care. We briefed the National Guard there on suicide prevention measures. And there was kind of a momentum that was happening. And we were really hopeful that we could help them establish a larger system of mental health care. That didn't end up unfolding, but obviously today, with the climate of what's happening in Ukraine, I feel so grateful that all the work that was done before, the vision that Dr. Zaporozhets had, there were services in place and there were training measures in place. So now we have more clinicians coming in that are getting trained to respond to the war. We had clinicians that were providing and are still providing telehealth services to those who have taken refuge elsewhere, or those who've come back to Ukraine since the war. And so I just feel so grateful to be a part of some of the beginnings of that project, because it's helped to establish a foundation of being able to provide trauma therapy for people. And there's just such an important need for it. Now the work with the project is, it's evolving. So some of our original dreams of creating a system of mental health care in 2017 have evolved, because now we know the need is so incredibly great. And so our team is working basically to establish a huge trauma center. It'll be a physical rehabilitation and mental health rehabilitation center that will house, we'll do like inpatient treatment, residential treatment, and outpatient treatment. So we're in the vision casting. We have plans drawn, and actual architectural plans. And so we hope it'll serve as a training institute to train clinicians in how to provide the best standards of care, while also providing a really necessary service that will be needed for years to come.
That's incredible.
Kaitlyn, I love all the work you did before this even happened. I mean, the war began. Is this new trauma center, is this going to be in Ukraine, or is that over here, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the organization, there's a lot of partnerships involved in this particular center. So the education, the institute I talked about, the actual master's program, the center, Open Doors Center, as well as there's a psychological association that they've established in Ukraine, are all partners with. We have a United States-based nonprofit, which is called International Mental Health Consulting. So there's a partnership of colleagues working together. Dr. Zaporozhets and Oksana Savak are two of the people that are really, they're the leaders of this project. And most of our American staff, American-based staff, with what we do with the operations, it's really kind of our ministry and our service work. So it's usually unpaid work that we do. So the center, or the institute, we'll call it the institute, that it's going to be a training institute of trauma therapy is going to be outside of Kiev. So it'll be in Ukraine. Yeah.
Well, I love what God's doing there with this ministry. And what do you think, though, some of the current challenges are in the trauma counseling world?
Yeah. What are some of the challenges? It's a good question, because I think as a society, we've all been exposed to so much when it comes to trauma in the last 5 years. I just think about the pandemic and how impactful that was for so many people and continues to be. And so I think there's a number of things with that. We're seeing how the pandemic has impacted mental health, on a broader scale. So that's a challenge for us to, we've heard that term, we're in a mental health crisis. And so I think it's so with that come a number of different issues, right? I think one of the things that I'm seeing is there's just a lack of providers, and not just a lack of providers in general, but a lack of providers who have the skill set that's needed, so trauma-informed skill set. And, that there's a couple of reasons I think for that. I think, one, the needs are growing. And so there's a need for more providers. And it's also, it's expensive to get trained, to become a clinician and even to have, outside of the master's degree, to have advanced training and specific modalities for trauma therapy. So I think people are wanting trauma-informed therapy and are looking for that in a lot of ways. And so sometimes they're running into barriers with being able to find providers. There's a lot of providers on wait lists, which also means, some burnout for clinicians out there. So I think there's a number of different challenges there.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. It seems like there is a definite limitation there. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for the work that you continue to do with all of these populations that need it so much. Now, personally speaking, as we talk about our Townsend Institute here, and the Townsend Growth Model is something that some of our listeners, and of course those that have been students or alumni in our program, are very familiar with. The Townsend Growth Model is something we teach and promote across all of our programs, counseling, coaching, and leadership. What are some ways in which you incorporate the Townsend Growth Model into your counseling practice?
Yeah. So, I started working at the Townsend Institute right at the beginning of the pandemic. So my experience in training as a trauma therapist really started long before my time at the Townsend Institute. So I would say that as I came on board at the Townsend Institute and did my own learning and growth with the Townsend model, that I really see it enhancing different areas of my own practice. So I think one thing is just the language that, Dr. Townsend has created with the 4 character capacities. I think that those fit really well with the trauma-informed model. So oftentimes trauma involves, attachment-related trauma. So if we're healing attachment-related wounds, then hopefully we're helping clients or ourselves to grow in our capacity for attachment. If we are, working on creating a better sense of self, we're working on creating boundaries, which often happens in trauma work. We're helping to build that capacity of separation. I think too so there are 5 main areas that trauma impacts in terms of a person's core beliefs. So those are safety, trust, power and control, esteem, and intimacy. And so I think what I often find is a lot of the work I'm doing and helping clients work through some of those core belief areas that are impacted by trauma is helping them to hold the good with the bad, right? Like a bad thing happened, and yet, here we have to somehow find hope and bounce back from that. And so there's a lot of integration work that I think comes in working through some of those. And obviously, if you think about safety, trust, power and control, like those are all involved in attachment and separation. So I think I see a good overlap with the model and with trauma-informed practice. I think, lastly, what I love is as an educator, I see it, and supervisor, I see it being really beneficial and helping to prepare students who will be working with clients, as they're providing trauma counseling for their own growth in those areas. Because if we have, a better, a higher capacity and attachment, separation, integration, and adulthood, then we're going to be able to provide a safer space for clients. We're going to be able to be more regulated when we hear difficult stories. And so I think it can really enhance our self-care and how we show up for our clients when we're doing that work.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. I mean, you said that regulated, right? I mean, because some of these things you're hearing about is so outside of anything normal or ethical, probably, that you have to be able to handle that and then be able to work with the client and give them some benefits. So what do you think, Kaitlyn, because you're deep into this and you know this really well, what are maybe some good articles or an author that you recommend if our listeners say, I want to learn more about trauma counseling?
Yeah, I have a whole list I can give you. So
maybe a couple.
Yeah, yeah. I think that there are a couple of, it's a good thing that I'm here and I can say I can give you many, because it means that people have been researching and helping to create resources on this topic, which is so phenomenal. So I think a couple that come to mind, I'm an EMDR certified clinician and consultant. And so Francine Shapiro was the creator of EMDR. And so a lot of her works have been really seminal for me. Bessel van der Kolk is one that many people have heard of. He's written The Body Keeps the Score, but that's one that we require our students to read as well. And I think it's one that I've had clients read as well. I think it really speaks to just the nature of trauma and how it impacts our bodies, our minds, our spirits. So Judith Herman is another author that I would highly recommend. She has a book called Trauma and Recovery that I think really explains about complex trauma. So a lot of times we think about trauma exposure and we think post-traumatic stress disorder, right? That's what comes up for us. And so authors like Judith Herman and then Courtois, another one, have written more about complex trauma and how that presents for people in their lives, how it's disruptive, as well as speaks into the healing process a good bit. So those would be some. I have many more that I could recommend as well.
That's very helpful for all of us clinicians or not to know a little bit about the resources that are now out there. I actually do want to take it a step back. And part of this is just my curiosity for those that maybe aren't part of, your world and your field of trauma therapy. What constitutes trauma therapy? I mean, clearly examples like the war in Ukraine, absolutely, but there's perhaps lesser known traumas or those that, might not overtly be classified as trauma. How, as a therapist, do you approach that? How do you categorize it? How do you teach your students to identify what warrants trauma therapy or not?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Ashley. And it's one that I think we've come to understand over time a little bit better about, what is trauma? I think that's always the question, right? When I teach the trauma crisis and trauma counseling course, that's the question we want to answer. What is it? Because then we need to know what do we do as clinicians with that? So I would say, it varies. There's some language out there that talks about big T trauma and little T trauma. And so when we think about big T trauma, those tend to be the types of experiences that might classify someone at some point with, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder. And those could be, or tend to be, things like experiencing a life-threatening event, or even witnessing a life-threatening event. So that could be like a car accident, where your life was almost in danger, or you witnessed someone's life in danger. That could be like combat experiences like we talked about. Sexual trauma is also one of those. And even, for example, a perfect example would be, so someone, for example, who works in child welfare, right? And they are working with caseloads of high abuse and neglect of children, just having exposure to that can actually result in like a big T trauma. So, and then little T trauma we talk about are just really distressing events. So, grief is a natural part of life, but it could actually be a little T trauma, right? So, it's something that is really life disrupting to lose someone. Our life might not have been threatened, but it can be extremely life disrupting. So that's something that someone might seek trauma counseling for. And then anything, let's say someone experienced child abuse when they were younger, or anything developmentally, or an extremely distressing event when they were younger. Perhaps they were bullied at school. Things like that might constitute someone coming in for trauma therapy. I will say, Ashley, one thing that I notice in the field and that I tell my students is sometimes clients don't know, or we don't know, that something was a traumatic event. It's less important to be able to define it that way. What we tend to notice are that there are patterns in our life that, for example, maybe our relationships are being impacted. So it kind of fits along with Dr. Townsend's model, right? We're noticing some issues with performance, with people, right? Personally. And so they're noticing some of those concerns coming up, and they might come to therapy and say, I don't know why this is happening, but something is coming up. I'm having these patterns of behavior or these feelings, or I'm constantly distressed. And, we'll talk about their history and perhaps find that there's something there that was traumatic. So I think there's a number of situations that might qualify as trauma, and that will be very different depending on the person and their life experiences.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you. I know that's helpful for me and hopefully for our listeners as well.
Yeah, I had not thought about the big T and little T trauma, but that's a great way to be able to break that apart. Well said, Kaitlyn. And, I love how we're able to, talk about the Townsend model and how that integrates in there with it. Also, your faith. How do you integrate your faith in these really difficult topics or situations that you deal with in trauma counseling?
Yeah. So the scripture that comes to mind when you ask that is Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. It's interesting because I really see the trauma healing process as a spiritual process. And there's literature that backs that up. There's concepts like post-traumatic growth that talk about how a person, so I have some colleagues, Compton and Shannonberg, they talk about resilience as bouncing back, post-traumatic growth as bouncing forward. And so there's a growth and transformation that can happen, that a person who's experienced a traumatic event, essentially what they would say is, without that event, I wouldn't have had that growth, which, feels kind of counterintuitive to say, but the research documents it, and I've seen it with, my own clients. And so there is such a spiritual process that's happening, and even the relationship, that I have with my clients, and the safety that has to be there. Like they have faith in me, right? And that could be really scary, to kind of, have someone's hope placed in your hands with their healing process. But I have to have my faith, placed in God to help me through that. And so I think I'm grateful for that, because it is hard to walk sometimes with people, and it's trusting the process, right? Having faith in my training, having faith in the skills I've gained, having faith in my clients, and also having faith in just what God's called me to do, and trusting that, that I can do that well with the guidance that I have from the Holy Spirit. So that's what comes to mind.
That's beautiful, Kaitlyn. Thank you so much. Love to hear the journey that God has put you on so far, and what he'll continue, I know, to do in your life, and therefore the lives of your patients down the road as well. We always like to ask our guests to leave us with one takeaway tip that our listeners might be able to apply to their own lives, to their own walks, to their own journeys. So what is your takeaway tip today?
Yeah. So I think I would not be giving you a trauma-informed answer if I didn't say nurture your nervous system. So I do this with clients. I talk about this with students. And even if you're not a counselor or a student of counseling, I just cannot speak about the importance of nurturing your nervous system. So that will look different for many different people, but our bodies store a lot. And so, attending to our nervous system is extremely important to reduce distress. So that could look like, going for a run. It could look like making sure you're getting good sleep. It probably looks like a number of things. That could look like meditation, yoga, prayer, anything that's going to help to regulate and calm our nervous systems is extremely good. If we are counselors, we need to be able to do that in order to sit with clients. And if you are someone who is thinking about, getting trauma counseling, hopefully that's something you're also hearing from your counselor, because the body is an important window to healing.
Well said.
I love that, Kaitlyn. Nurture your nervous system. I mean, I feel like that could be like on a t-shirt too, or something. I mean, that is really helpful, because helping professions, that's sometimes what everybody forgets to do, is go and make sure they're taking care of themselves, right? We talk about that. You got to have a need to need. So thank you so much, Kaitlyn, for joining us today and really educating myself and I believe our listeners, nationally, everyone on trauma and then what's going on in Ukraine and how you are having an impact on it. So thank you.
Yes,
awesome. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Take care.
Special thanks to Gadesa Labawa, CUI alumni, for the Tips Podcast music. If you enjoyed the Townsend Institute Podcast Series, head to our website, cui.edu/Townsend, to find out more about the certificates or bachelor's, master's, or doctoral degrees offered through Concordia University, Irvine. With programs in organizational psychology, mental health counseling, executive coaching consulting, and organizational leadership, we have a variety of faith-based programs dedicated to helping you fulfill your academic and professional goals, all while further developing your competence and character. Again, that's cui.edu/Townsend.